Welcome back to the podcast.
We have a great show for you today.
Welcome to the debate. What if I told you that cleaning your desk, or taking a 10-minute walk without your phone, or simply refusing to send a sarcastic tweet, were actually mechanisms for preventing global warfare?
Well, if I'm listening to this right now, I'm probably thinking, that is incredibly privileged and frankly absurd.
Right, I know it sounds...
I mean, how does a mindfulness walk do anything to stop a tank or dismantle an unjust law?
Exactly. It sounds entirely disproportionate, right, to equate personal calmness with dismantling systemic oppression. But that is the core of the concept we are interrogating today, which is micropeace.
Yes, micropeace.
The premise here is that large-scale global conflict is not just a sudden explosion of political will. It is an inferno fed by millions of tiny individual choices of casual hostility. And, more importantly, that this conflict can be starved of its fuel through daily intentional choices of empathy and linguistic precision.
It is definitely a provocative thesis. We are looking at whether an individual refusing to be hostile online or, finding personal calm in their daily routine has any actual bearing on the machinery of war.
Precisely.
Or conversely, whether this is just a comforting illusion.
Right. And I take the position that it is absolutely not an illusion. I argue that micropeace, this strict discipline of emotional regulation and the absolute refusal to dehumanize others in our ordinary interactions, is the foundational mechanism for dismantling the psychological stepping stones that lead to extremism.
Okay, but
Just to finish the thought, without actively rooting out everyday hostility at the civilian level, societies remain highly vulnerable to the kind of radicalization that makes macro-level war possible.
And I take the opposing perspective on this. While I don't deny that micropeace is, psychologically comforting for the individual, framing it as a solution to actual material conflict risks turning it into a dangerous distraction.
A distraction?
Yes, a distraction. This hyper-focus on personal calmness can inadvertently lead us to turn a blind eye to the systemic power dynamics that genuinely drive oppression. It basically treats a coping mechanism for living in a chaotic world as if it were the cure for the chaos itself.
Well, let's break down why this individual sphere is actually the necessary battleground for peace. If we trace the documented trajectory of how hate scales up, it never starts with a sudden massive declaration of violence.
Right. It's gradual.
Exactly. It starts very quietly with prejudice. And prejudice isn't just a bad thought, it is a cognitive shortcut. When we judge someone by their religion, their accent, or their passport before we even know them, we're essentially saving our brain the energy of understanding a complex human being.
I'll agree with the psychology of that, sure. We categorize to simplify the world.
Right. But if that cognitive shortcut isn't actively challenged by the individual, it hardens into intolerance. We go from simply categorizing people to fundamentally refusing to accept that other people can live differently than we do.
Right, and then that escalates.
It does. When that intolerance is repeated and validated, especially in our media and daily conversations, it breeds open hostility. And hostility is the exact pavement required for oppression and radicalization.
I see where you're going with this.
Everyday people fuel the fire through incredibly mundane choices, like sharing hateful content, using sarcastic, dismissive language, or treating complex political arguments like a team sport where the only goal is to humiliate the enemy.
Wait, I need to stop you right there. I understand the psychological progression you are mapping out, prejudice to intolerance to hostility. But look at the application of those concepts in the real world.
Okay.
You are assuming that systemic oppression requires the enthusiastic hostile consent of the population to function, and history suggests otherwise.
How so?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of power. Oppression requires a profound power imbalance. It is cruel treatment dictated by those holding systemic leverage against those who cannot easily defend themselves.
True.
That cruelty is enforced through physical, economic, or social violence. If a powerful political entity decides to economically disenfranchise a minority group, the fact that an ordinary civilian refuses to laugh at a prejudiced joke does absolutely nothing to change the economic reality of that oppressed group.
I mean, it
It simply means the civilian gets to sleep at night with a clear, micro-peaceful conscience. The machinery of power operates on capital, leverage, and force, not individual linguistic politeness.
I see the logic there, but I think it fundamentally misunderstands the supply chain of power. You mentioned that the machinery of power operates on force, but who wields the force?
Well, the state.
But tanks are driven by citizens. Checkpoints are staffed by ordinary people. Laws are enforced by bureaucrats and police officers who have to go home to their families at the end of the day.
Yes, they are individuals, but
Power cannot enforce widespread oppression if the ordinary citizens responsible for the day-to-day operation of society experience paralyzing cognitive dissonance every time they are asked to inflict pain.
so you were saying the state requires the civilians' lack of empathy to function.
Exactly. To get an ordinary person to execute an unjust, cruel directive, the state must first strip the humanity from the target. Dehumanization is the necessary lubricant for the machinery of force.
Right.
And that dehumanization doesn't happen overnight in a government briefing. It happens in the comment sections. It happens in the jokes that aren't really jokes. It happens when we accept small injustices as normal.
Okay, I follow the logic.
When an individual chooses micropeace, when they say, I vehemently disagree with your politics, but I refuse to view you as a monster, they are actively disrupting the supply chain of dehumanization. They are acting as a psychological firewall.
A firewall.
Yes. A population whose minds are calm and who refuse to engage in daily hostility is mathematically much harder to radicalize.
Mathematically much harder to radicalize. It sounds compelling. But let's test that firewall in the specific arena where everyday civilians supposedly wield all this influence today, which is the digital sphere.
Let's do it.
Because this is where the concept of fueling the fire really meets reality. Now, I completely agree that minimizing digital hostility is a moral good. No one likes a troll.
Right, obviously.
But we have to ask a critical question here. Does the pursuit of digital calmness actually encourage people to look away from profound injustice just to preserve their own comfort?
Ah, you're talking about the risk of turning a blind eye.
Precisely. If my overarching goal for the day is to maintain my 10-minute walk, deep breathing, highly curated, calm state of mind, the absolute easiest way to achieve that is to simply ignore the difficult political realities.
I see what you mean, but
I log off, I don't look at the footage of the protest, I don't engage with the systemic bullying happening in my community. It becomes a retreat into moral purity, where I prioritize my aesthetic peace over material justice.
that is a critical distinction. But I think you are conflating micropeace with silence, and they are not the same thing.
How are they different in practice?
Well, silence certainly protects our comfort, but it abandons the victims. If everyone turns a blind eye, injustice grows stronger. Micropeace is not about ignoring the fire. It is about choosing not to throw more wood onto it under the delusion that we are helping.
But how is expressing outrage throwing wood on the fire? Anger is a natural human response to seeing someone crushed by a system.
Because of the economics of the platform you're expressing that outrage on, we have to look at how social media algorithms actually monetize hostility.
Right. The engagement metrics.
Exactly. The architecture of these digital spaces requires sensationalism and anger to keep users engaged. Hate is literally the currency of the algorithm.
So the medium matters.
Hugely. When people share shocking videos without fact-checking or post angry, sarcastic messages to quote-unquote destroy an opponent online, they genuinely believe they are fighting injustice. But structurally, they are just providing free labor to an industrial machine designed to polarize society.
So the user's intention is irrelevant to the machine.
Completely irrelevant. The algorithm doesn't care if your outrage is righteous or prejudiced. It only cares that it is highly engaging.
Wow. Okay.
Therefore, micropeace, this discipline of engaging with facts, empathy, and respect rather than a raw, reactive anger, is actually a distributed strike against the economy of hostility. By pausing before you post, by refusing to supply the raw material of hate, you are financially starving a machine that relies on our polarization to function. It is a highly substantive act of systemic sabotage.
I will concede that calling it a distributed strike against the economy of hostility is a brilliant framing. That is a very strong point.
Thank you.
But let's look at what you are sacrificing by demanding this emotional regulation. If someone sees an act of profound social or economic oppression, anger is not only a natural response, historically, it is often the only catalyst for systemic change.
But
Just think about the labor movement, the civil rights movement. These did not succeed simply because people calmly stated their facts. They succeeded because people mobilized their righteous anger to disrupt the status quo.
mobilization and unmanaged hostility are different mechanisms.
Are they always? By telling ordinary people that their anger is just fueling the fire and that they should instead prioritize empathy and careful listening, we risk pacifying the exact energy required to challenge entrenched power.
And I don't think it pacifies it, I think it focuses it.
It feels like asking someone trapped in a burning building to make sure they fold their laundry so the room looks tidy. Yes, the laundry is folded. The room is calm. But the fire is still going to consume them.
I actually love that metaphor, folding laundry in a burning building. Let's grapple with that, because it gets to the heart of what emotional regulation actually does in a crisis.
Okay, let's unpack it.
If you are in a burning building, sheer panic and screaming, which is unmanaged hostility, will likely cause you to inhale more smoke, make irrational decisions, and trample the people trying to escape with you.
Fair point.
The people who historically dismantled systemic oppression did not do so by mimicking the chaotic hostility of their oppressors. They did it through profound, calculated emotional discipline.
So you are saying micropeace is the discipline required to find the exit.
Exactly. Peace is not weakness. Peace is emotional strength. When someone lives with fear, humiliation, and unmanaged anger for a long time, cognitive dissonance breaks down. They become incredibly easy to radicalize.
Because they are desperate.
Right. They start to believe that indiscriminate violence is the only answer left. Micropeace, the stubborn insistence on seeing the human being across from you, even when you are angry, is the only known prophylactic against that radicalization. If you abandon that discipline in the name of fighting systemic power, you inevitably just replace one set of oppressive extremists with another. You become the monster you are fighting.
That is a heavy claim, assuming that resistance without this specific framing of micropeace inevitably mutates into monstrous behavior. But let's test this prophylactic in a scenario where the systemic power is already fully entrenched.
Okay.
Let's talk about the ultimate goal here, which is reconciliation. We know that true reconciliation is a slow, agonizing process of rebuilding trust. It means choosing not to repeat the harm.
Right. It starts with the willingness to say, I am ready to listen.
Yes. And if two neighbors or two coworkers have a dispute, choosing not to repeat the harm is entirely within their personal agency. That is micropeace functioning perfectly.
Glad we agree on that.
But what happens when the harm isn't an interpersonal dispute? What happens when the harm is living in a conflict zone where civilians cannot even plan their week, or where prejudice is codified into the very passport you hold?
The scale of the trauma is obviously vastly different.
It's not just the scale of the trauma, it is the total lack of agency. A civilian living under bombardment cannot choose to stop the harm. Only the people in power, the politicians, the generals, can stop the physical destruction.
That's true.
If an oppressed civilian says, "I am ready to listen," it is a beautiful, noble, poetic sentiment, but it does not stop the bombs. It does not provide the dignity of a normal, boring day where your biggest problem is what to eat for dinner. Elevating micropeace in this context places the massive burden of conflict resolution squarely onto the shoulders of the victims.
Wait, how does it place the burden on the victims?
Because it essentially tells them the politicians will continue to push the macro conflict for leverage and resources, but you, the victim, must ensure your language is gentle and your mind is calm so you don't, quote-unquote, fuel the fire.
That's not...
It is a profound mismatch of scale. It tells the oppressed to manage their tone while the oppressor manages the military.
I completely reject the idea that micropeace is tone policing the oppressed. It is the exact opposite. It is recognizing the ultimate agency of the ordinary human being in a world that constantly tries to strip them of it.
But they don't have the agency to stop the war.
Yes, politicians make the macro decisions about when the bombs drop. But who carries the weight of those decisions? The civilians. They carry the trauma in their bodies, in their memories, and in their children's futures.
Absolutely.
And Because they carry that immense weight, they are inevitably the ones who must rebuild society when the systemic conflicts finally pause.
But rebuilding requires material resources, not just good intentions.
It requires both. But the psychological foundation must come first. You cannot legislate trust. You can sign a peace treaty with a pen, but you can only root out hate in private conversations, in the refusal to pass your trauma down to the next generation, and in the conscious choice to not let intolerance sound normal around your dinner table.
I see.
If you don't have individuals capable of making those granular, incredibly difficult choices, macro-level treaties are completely meaningless. They will collapse the moment the political winds change, because the cultural baseline still demands retribution.
I don't disagree that a culture of retribution makes treaties fragile. That is historically accurate. But I keep coming back to the material conditions. You say we need this psychological foundation before we can rebuild.
Yes.
I argue that people cannot focus on their psychological foundation when their material reality is completely unstable. We keep talking about the luxury of a boring, peaceful day. That boredom is a privilege. It is the result of functioning infrastructure, human rights, and political stability.
So you view micropeace as a luxury product of a stable society rather than the building block of one?
Precisely. If I spend my day curating a respectful online presence and rooting out prejudice in my immediate circle, I might feel a profound sense of moral accomplishment. I might feel I've contributed to world peace.
But
the material conditions of those suffering under state-sponsored oppression haven't changed one iota. They still cannot plan their week. They still fear for their children's safety. My polite language hasn't dismantled the economic incentives that keep their oppressors in power.
well,
By focusing so heavily on our own linguistic precision and emotional regulation, we risk substituting an aesthetic peace for actual material justice. We make our immediate surroundings softer, while the world remains just as hard for those under the boot of power.
I think we have hit the absolute bedrock of our disagreement here. For my part, I maintain that making our immediate surroundings quote-unquote softer is not an aesthetic luxury. It is the essential groundwork for survival and eventual change.
And
Without the daily discipline of rooting out hostility, refusing to dehumanize our political opponents, and maintaining our own emotional strength, societies become incredibly vulnerable to the algorithmic and psychological radicalization that makes those larger wars possible.
Yeah, I hear you.
The systemic material changes we both desperately want to see simply cannot be sustained by a population that has completely lost its basic capacity for empathy.
And I maintain that while individual empathy and emotional regulation are morally good and unquestionably necessary for personal psychological well-being, we cannot pretend they are systemic solutions.
Right.
True peace requires confronting the macro-level power structures that inflict harm and dismantling the economic and political incentives that drive that harm. We must be incredibly careful not to conflate our personal coping strategies with political action, lest we pacify ourselves while the building burns around us.
Despite the sharp tension, there are profound points of convergence here. We both clearly agree on the absolute tragedy of the macro conflict. Civilians are never the winners.
Never.
They are the ones who carry the weight, who lose their homes, and who simply want the profound dignity of a boring, normal day.
We definitely agree on that. And we also agree on the mechanics of how violence is justified. The dehumanization of ordinary people, reducing a complex human life to a stereotype based on their passport or religion, is the absolute necessary prerequisite for any act of war or systemic oppression.
Yes, exactly.
Once you successfully train a population to no longer see a human, cognitive dissonance fades, and it becomes terrifyingly easy to accept their pain.
Exactly. It leaves us with a profound reflection on the inherent tension between managing our own internal emotional landscape and addressing the crushing external realities of the world.
Right. It's a difficult balance.
Are these two scales of peace, the micro and the macro, sequential steps, where personal empathy must precede political change? Or are they entirely distinct phenomena, where one is personal survival and the other is political warfare?
It forces the listener to evaluate their own daily actions, doesn't it?
It asks us to decide how much weight our individual choices actually carry in the face of global conflict, and whether maintaining our own peace is a genuine catalyst for change or just a comfortable shelter from the storm.
Which brings us back to that massive forest fire. Perhaps the inferno is inevitable, driven by the massive, uncontrollable winds of politics, algorithms, and power. But then again, perhaps the only way to genuinely fireproof the forest is to ensure that leaf by dry leaf, we simply refuse to catch the spark. Thank you for joining us.